What would you do if your HOA decided your private farm was now a public park, without asking for permission? Ethan Carter had seen his fair share of absurdity, but this? This was something else entirely. Standing on his porch, coffee in hand, he watched in stunned disbelief as a group of people strolled leisurely through his fields, trampling crops, snapping pictures, and even helping themselves to his freshly grown produce as if they had personally planted each seed. They climbed over his fences, stepped on carefully tended vegetable rows, and treated his farm like some weekend retreat they had paid admission for. And leading them, of course, was Karen Whitmore. The self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, HOA president, and an all-around menace to his existence. For years, she had made it her mission to micromanage every inch of the community. Complaints about his barn? Filed. The scent of his livestock? Offensive. The color of his fence? Not in line with the neighborhood aesthetic. But this time, she had crossed a line Ethan could not ignore. "Oh, don't mind us, Ethan," Karen called out, her voice dripping with exaggerated politeness. She waved a manicured hand as though he were nothing more than a farmhand rather than the owner of the very land she was standing on. "We're just taking a little walk. Fresh air, you know. Your land has such a rustic charm, so quaint." Ethan's grip tightened around his coffee mug, his jaw clenched as he took a slow breath. "Karen, this is private property." Karen gasped, placing a hand on her chest in mock offense. "Oh, come now, Ethan. We're neighbors. And besides, the HOA has voted that we should have community access to all shared spaces." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "You voted?" Karen beamed, oblivious to the growing storm behind Ethan's gaze. "Of course. Your farm adds to the scenic value of our neighborhood, and it's only fair that we get to enjoy it." His patience was hanging by a thread. He scanned the growing disaster, kids picking apples right off his trees, a couple posing for what was clearly an engagement photo shoot, and one man helping himself to a fresh tomato, biting into it like he was sampling produce at a farmer's market. His land. His work. His livelihood. And Karen was treating it like a community playground. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down on the porch railing. Enough was enough. Ethan's fingers twitched at his sides as he surveyed the growing disaster unfolding on his land. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to put an immediate stop to this, but he knew better than to waste his breath arguing with Karen. She didn't listen. She didn't care. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, on pushing boundaries until someone pushed back, and right now, she thought she had won. So Ethan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or plead for reason. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked toward the barn. "Oh, there he goes," Karen said with a smirk, her voice carrying easily across the field. "Always so sensitive. He'll calm down in a few minutes." The confidence in her tone nearly made Ethan laugh. If only she knew. Inside the barn, the earthy scent of hay and wood filled the dimly lit space. A familiar rustling stirred near the back, followed by the unmistakable sound of paws shifting against the wooden floor. Two sets of keen eyes locked onto him, waiting. Titan, a towering 150-pound mass of muscle and fur, lifted his massive head first, his deep brown eyes sharp and alert. Beside him, leaner but just as powerful, was Ranger, ears flicking forward, his entire body coiled like a spring ready to launch. Ethan crouched, running a hand over Titan's broad head. The dog didn't need words to understand. His tail gave a single, slow wag. He was ready. "Go say hello," Ethan murmured. The moment the barn doors swung open, the dogs burst forward like thunder rolling across the field. The first scream split the air before Ethan even made it back outside. People scrambled in every direction, tripping over themselves in sheer panic. A man went down hard, his arms flailing as he crashed into a row of crushed lettuce. A woman shrieked as she lost her footing in her designer heels, falling face first into the dirt. Karen's smug confidence evaporated in an instant as Titan and Ranger tore through the crowd like avenging spirits. Titan lunged toward a picnic basket, flipping it over with a single swipe of his paw, sending food scattering across the ground. Ranger, ever the herder, darted back and forth, ensuring that no one had a chance to regroup before driving them all toward the fence line. Karen stumbled backward, eyes wide with panic, her once pristine white blouse now streaked with dirt. "You'll regret this," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at Ethan as she sprinted toward safety. Ethan took his time, casually picking up his coffee again and taking a slow sip. "Doubt it," he muttered. It was over in minutes. By the time the last trespasser made it to the fence, panting and disheveled, the field was littered with toppled chairs, spilled drinks, and abandoned shoes from people who had run so fast they hadn't even realized they'd lost them. Titan and Ranger sat at attention, their tails wagging with satisfaction, as if they had just completed the world's most entertaining game. For a brief moment, Ethan allowed himself to believe it was done, that maybe, just maybe, Karen had finally learned her lesson. But deep down, he knew better. 2 mornings later, he had his answer. The sound of a car pulling up to his property made him look up from his work, and when he saw the white SUV with the city's animal control emblem printed on the side, a slow, simmering anger settled in his chest. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and made his way over as the officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, stepped out of the vehicle, clipboard in hand. "Afternoon, sir," the officer said. "We received a report about 2 aggressive dogs on this property. Came to check it out." Ethan exhaled sharply, already knowing exactly where this was coming from. He crossed his arms and smirked. "Let me guess. A blonde woman with an inflated sense of self-importance and a voice like nails on a chalkboard?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "So you already know who called." "Didn't take much guessing." Ethan let out a sharp whistle, and within seconds, Titan and Ranger trotted over. Titan sat down heavily at Ethan's feet, his head reaching nearly to his owner's waist, while Ranger, ever the showman, dropped something at the officer's feet, a half-empty champagne bottle he had apparently stolen from one of the trespassers days ago. The officer snorted. "Yeah, these look real dangerous." Ethan shrugged. "Terrifying, aren't they?" The officer crouched down, rubbing behind Titan's ears as the massive dog leaned into the attention. "I get complaints like this all the time. HOA types who don't like that they can't control everything." He flipped his clipboard shut. "From what I see, these dogs aren't aggressive, just well-trained." Ethan nodded. "That, and they don't take kindly to trespassers." The officer stood and shook his head. "Since there's no evidence of aggression, this complaint doesn't hold water. I'll be marking it as unfounded. But if she keeps harassing you, you might want to think about filing something against her instead." Ethan's smirk widened. Now that was an idea. As the SUV pulled away, Ethan glanced down at Titan and Ranger, who both looked back up at him, ears perked. "Looks like Karen wants to play dirty," he mused, his fingers brushing over Ranger's head. The dog gave a slow wag of his tail, eyes bright with mischief. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then they'd play. Ethan had expected Karen to lick her wounds and move on, maybe find some other poor soul to terrorize with her obsessive need for control. But he should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to come back harder, doubling down on her nonsense until she got her way. 2 days after the animal control fiasco, Ethan stepped outside to check on his crops, only to freeze in place. It took him a full 3 seconds to process what he was looking at. His farm had been transformed into an upscale brunch venue. Tables draped in pristine white linen stretched across his fields, folding chairs crushing his carefully tended crops. Platters of croissants, fresh fruit, and pastries sat neatly arranged alongside bottles of champagne that caught the morning sunlight. Waiters, actual waiters, in crisp black vests moved through the setup, refilling glasses of mimosas as if this were some high-end country club. At the head of it all, reclining beneath a white canopy, was Karen. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat tilted at a fashionable angle, her designer sunglasses reflecting the golden rays of morning. A flute of champagne rested delicately between her fingers as she casually lifted it in greeting. "Oh, Ethan," she called, smiling as though she hadn't just trespassed onto his land again. "There you are. Come join us, the croissants are absolutely divine." Ethan's entire body tensed. His land. His work. His crops, now crushed beneath folding chairs and designer shoes. His patience snapped. He took slow, deliberate steps forward, his voice dangerously low. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen waved a dismissive hand, unfazed. "We felt our last visit ended on a sour note, so we decided to try again. You can't be so selfish with all this beautiful land, Ethan. It deserves to be appreciated." Ethan's jaw locked as he scanned the scene. Guests sipped their drinks, laughing and chatting like they had every right to be there. A couple posed by his fence, using it as a rustic backdrop for their aesthetic photo shoot. And then, his blood turned ice cold. A man near the far end of the field had pulled out a knife. With casual ease, the man sliced into one of Ethan's apples, biting into it as though he had picked it off his own backyard tree. Something inside Ethan snapped. He didn't yell. Didn't argue. Didn't waste time trying to talk sense into people who clearly had none. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked toward the barn. Behind him, Karen chuckled, swirling her champagne. "Oh, there he goes again, probably off to pout. He'll calm down in a few minutes." She had no idea. The barn doors creaked as Ethan pushed them open, the scent of hay and earth thick in the warm morning air. Titan and Ranger were already awake, their ears flicking up as soon as they saw him. Ethan knelt beside them, his voice a low murmur. "You know what to do." Titan let out a deep, rumbling growl. Ranger's tail wagged. And then they ran. The first scream pierced the air before Ethan even stepped back outside. Titan barreled through the field like a freight train, knocking over chairs, sending plates and glasses flying. Ranger, quicker and more strategic, darted straight for the long table, grabbing the lace tablecloth in his teeth and yanking it clean off, sending everything crashing to the ground. Champagne bottles toppled. Silverware clattered. Guests screeched and scrambled, tripping over themselves in their frantic effort to escape. One man made the colossal mistake of trying to climb Ethan's fence. He managed to get one leg over before losing his balance and falling straight into a pile of manure. Ethan took his time, walking back onto the field, arms crossed as he watched his land reclaim itself. Karen, her pristine white dress now streaked with dirt and what was probably spilled champagne, spun in furious circles, arms flailing. "Call them off. Call them off." Ethan leaned against the barn door. "Why? I thought you wanted to enjoy the land." "This isn't funny," she shrieked, backing away as Titan trotted toward her, his massive frame casting a shadow over her trembling form. Ethan tilted his head. "I disagree." Titan lunged, not at Karen, but at the remains of the brunch table, grabbing a half-eaten sandwich and shaking it wildly before trotting off, tail wagging. Ranger, not to be outdone, snatched a champagne bottle in his jaws and took off across the field like it was his new favorite toy. Karen let out an incoherent scream, shoving past fleeing guests as she sprinted toward the nearest exit. "We'll leave. We'll leave." Ethan gave a sharp whistle. Immediately, Titan and Ranger halted, standing still as silent sentinels, their eyes locked on the remaining intruders. Karen staggered to her feet, her face twisted in rage. Her once perfect hair was disheveled, her dress stained, her voice raw from screaming. "You're going to regret this," she spat. Ethan's smile was slow and deliberate. Doubt it. Karen stormed off, her remaining guests following in a miserable parade of defeat. Ethan let out a long breath, running a hand over Titan's head as he watched the last of them disappear past the property line. It should have ended there. But later that night, as Ethan checked his farm's website, he saw them, an onslaught of fake reviews. Horrible experience, completely unsafe. The farmer is aggressive. This place should be shut down. Wild animals roaming freely, absolutely terrifying. I found a hair in my food. And the service? Just awful. Ethan sat back, inhaling slowly. Karen wasn't just trying to trespass anymore. She was trying to destroy him. A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. If Karen wanted a war, he'd give her one. Ethan had known Karen would retaliate, but even he hadn't expected this level of insanity. He had woken up that morning, stepped outside with his coffee, and immediately felt something was off. The air smelled too sweet, too manufactured. Then he saw it, the final insult, the ultimate act of arrogance. His farm had been transformed into a wedding venue. Not just any wedding, a high-end, picture-perfect, country-chic wedding straight out of a luxury bridal magazine. Rows of elegant white chairs were neatly arranged in the middle of his field, crushing his crops beneath their pristine legs. A long floral archway stretched over a white silk runner that led straight through the heart of his property. A catering staff in pressed black uniforms bustled around tables covered in fine lace, setting down trays of hors d'oeuvres. And at the center of it all, Karen. Seated at a table draped in gold-trimmed linen, she wore a fitted cream-colored dress that looked far too bridal for someone who wasn't getting married. She adjusted the brim of her absurdly large sun hat, tilting it at just the right angle to shield her face from the sun while still allowing the hired photographer to capture her in what she no doubt considered her best light. Ethan's grip on his coffee mug tightened. Karen lifted a champagne flute in his direction and had the audacity to smile. "Oh, Ethan. There you are," she called in that syrupy voice that made his teeth grind. "We figured you wouldn't mind if we used the land one last time, for something truly special. Just look at how beautiful it is when shared with the community." Ethan's jaw flexed as he forced himself to inhale slowly through his nose. He scanned the scene, noting the sheer amount of damage already done. His carefully tended vegetable rows were flattened beneath folding chairs, his fence was being used as a backdrop for someone's aesthetic engagement photos, and a group of women in pastel dresses were giggling as they clinked champagne glasses right on top of his freshly planted strawberry beds. And then his eyes landed on the cake. A massive, 5-tier wedding cake, elegantly decorated with delicate sugar flowers, sat right in the middle of his grazing pasture. Ethan had spent years making this land his own, growing his crops, raising his animals, putting in backbreaking work. And yet, Karen had once again decided she could claim it as hers with nothing more than a smug smile and a fabricated sense of entitlement. He didn't yell. He didn't storm in. He just turned and walked back to the barn. Karen sighed dramatically. "Oh dear. There he goes again," she mused to a nearby guest, swirling her drink. "Always so touchy. He'll calm down in a few minutes." She truly, genuinely believed that. She had no idea. Ethan didn't need to tell Titan and Ranger twice. The moment the barn doors swung open, they knew. Titan lunged forward like a wrecking ball of muscle and fur, heading straight for the wedding aisle. Ranger, faster and more strategic, darted between tables, weaving through panicked guests like a shadow, targeting the food first. The first blood-curdling scream came as Titan charged straight through the cake. The towering confection toppled in a spectacular explosion of frosting and expensive sugarwork, splattering across the ground as guests screamed and stumbled backward. Ranger snatched a whole plate of delicate finger sandwiches and took off across the field, his tail wagging like he had just won the best prize of his life. A woman in stilettos tripped over the silk wedding runner, crashing into a table of champagne bottles. The bottles tumbled, shattering against the ground in an explosion of glass and golden liquid. Ethan emerged from the barn just in time to see one unfortunate man, the officiant, by the looks of him, try to scramble over the fence in a desperate escape. He didn't make it. His foot caught on the top rail, sending him tumbling face first into a pile of manure. Karen, meanwhile, was spinning in circles, arms flailing, her pristine dress now streaked with dirt, cake, and what looked suspiciously like bird droppings. "Call them OFF," she screeched, her voice raw with panic. Ethan leaned casually against the fence, arms crossed. "Why? I thought you wanted to enjoy the land." "This isn't funny," she shrieked, backing away as Titan barreled toward her, his massive paws sending up dust. Ethan lifted an eyebrow. "Oh, I disagree." Titan veered at the last second, slamming into the wedding archway instead. The fragile structure toppled like a house of cards, the delicate flower arrangements crumpling beneath its weight. Karen let out an inhuman screech, pointing wildly. "You! I'll have you shut down. I'll sue. I'll. Ethan gave a sharp whistle. Instantly, Titan and Ranger stopped in their tracks, standing still like stone guardians, eyes locked on the remaining guests. Karen, panting, dirt-streaked, her hat hanging off at an awkward angle, turned to Ethan with murder in her eyes. "You are going to regret this." Ethan smirked. "Doubt it." Karen let out a frustrated scream before shoving past the remaining guests, her heels sinking into the churned-up dirt as she stormed off toward her car. Ethan watched her go, the chaos of the destruction around him feeling more satisfying than it probably should have. But he knew Karen wasn't done. Later that night, as he checked his business email, the first wave of fake complaints hit. "This farm is completely unsafe, dangerous animals roaming freely. The owner is aggressive and unprofessional. 0 stars. Found hair in my food, disgusting. Do not visit." Ethan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the wooden table. Karen wasn't just trying to steal his land anymore. She was trying to destroy him. A slow, dangerous smirk curled at the edges of his lips. Oh, Karen. She had no idea who she was messing with. Ethan had spent years dealing with Karen's antics, but this time, she had made a critical mistake. She didn't just trespass. She didn't just overstep. She went too far. And now, it was her turn to suffer the consequences. With every piece of security footage, every illegal event, every false accusation, Ethan compiled a devastating package of evidence. He included timestamps, legal notes on trespassing laws, screenshots of the HOA rules Karen had blatantly ignored, and a record of the false complaints she had filed against him. Then, he sent a copy directly to the HOA's legal department. It didn't take long. By the next afternoon, Karen was at his gate, arms crossed, jaw tight, the rage practically radiating off her. The HOA had turned on her. The very organization she had ruled with an iron fist had officially disavowed her actions, publicly stating that she had acted alone and that her behavior was in direct violation of the community's standards. She had been stripped of her leadership position. She had been fined heavily for the damage caused by her unauthorized gatherings. And, worst of all for Karen, the neighbors, the people she had controlled for years, had finally had enough. They were embarrassed by the chaos she had brought to the community. Humiliated by the public exposure of her entitlement. Fed up with the way she had used the HOA as a personal weapon. Karen was officially powerless. Her face was red with fury as she glared at Ethan. "The HOA board has requested that I formally apologize for any misunderstandings," she gritted out through clenched teeth. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Misunderstandings?" Her eye twitched. "Fine. I apologize for overstepping. And for the false report." Ethan tapped his chin. "And for treating my farm like a public park?" Her nails dug into her palms. Yes. Ethan smiled slowly. Well, that's a start. Karen's glare could have melted steel. She turned on her heel and stormed off without another word, but it didn't matter. Because the next week, a for sale sign went up in her yard. By the end of the month, she was gone. Ethan stood on his porch, Titan and Ranger at his side, watching as Karen's SUV pulled away for the last time. Lifting his coffee mug, he gave a mock toast. Safe travels, Karen. Try not to trespass wherever you end up next. And just like that, she was out of his life, for good. Because some people never learn. And some people? They just don't get to win. Have you ever had to deal with an entitled HOA or a Karen in your life? Share your stories below, let's see who had it worse.